you have to determine, is the data you're receiving, is it good data? Is it correct data? Am I making the proper kind of judgment? And a lot of time an engineer will say, well, here's the data, boom, we'll make the decision. Well, there's a lot more hidden stuff behind the data that you got to pull out. And that's what a historian does. And it really, I realized once I became the chief knowledge officer and we were, doing case studies and kind of learning how to gain knowledge and then share knowledge, I realized I was actually using my history degree. And I wish so much my father was alive. Could I say, I finally used my history degree. It finally paid off.
Hey everyone, welcome to a brand new episode of ContraMinds. In today's episode, we are in conversation with Roger Forsgren. Roger served as the Chief Knowledge Officer of NASA from 2013 to 2021. As CKO, he led NASA's knowledge management efforts, ensuring that the agency's workforce had access to critical knowledge needed for mission success. He also served as Director of the NASA Academy of Program, Project and Engineering Leadership, internally known as APPLE, the agency's education and training program in the fields of project management, systems engineering, and leadership development. Over the course of his career, Roger has received multiple awards and honors, including NASA's Silver Snoopy and the Manned Flight Awareness Award. Under his leadership, APPLE was named the best academy in the world in 2015 by Human System International, a subsidiary of the Project Management Institute. In 2016, Roger and his team at APPLE received NASA's Group Achievement Award for providing world-class training to the agency's project management and systems engineering communities. Roger most recently is the author of the book Lean Knowledge Management: How NASA Implemented a Practical KM Program, where he lays out the principles, tactics, and strategies he implemented at NASA during his tenure as the Chief Knowledge Officer. Roger is a student of history and believes that lessons from the past hold the key to paving the road to the future. In this conversation, Roger talks to us about his career at NASA, the foundational ideas that underlie the practice of knowledge management, and why being at the intersection of history and engineering is a unique competitive advantage. As always, we have shared selected links and show notes from this episode on the ContraMinds website. You can check it out at www.contraminds.com/blog. And now, here is our conversation with Roger Forsgren. And we are live. So, Roger, thank you so much for agreeing to be a part of ContraMinds. Over the next couple of hours, we want to go through your career, your tenure at NASA, and the relationship between history and your take on knowledge management. So we have an amazing conversation lined up for our listeners, and I thank you so much for agreeing to be a part of this conversation.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to it.
Lovely. So, Roger, my first question to you is that you have a very interesting comparison between the butterfly effect and a well-managed knowledge management program. Can you explain this?
Sure. In chaos theory, they talk about the butterfly effect, and it kind of originates, and it's very important to me because I happen to live in Florida. So there's a butterfly on the Atlantic coast near the Sahara Desert in Africa, and this is where the area where the cold air and the warm air are starting to mix, and a little butterfly can fly by and kind of start mixing the air, and all of a sudden, within weeks and months, that cold air and warm air mixture turns into a storm. It moves out into the Atlantic and it grows bigger and eventually ends up being a hurricane. So it just kind of shows the dramatic effect something small can have on a big system. And I look at knowledge management the same way. It doesn't have to be a huge organization, or it has to be a huge knowledge management doesn't have to be a huge project with a huge budget to make some pretty incredible changes within an organization. And I think we managed to do that at NASA. We didn't have a giant budget, but we were smart with the money we had. We had some good people, and we just kind of focused on the technical workforce. And I think in a matter of years, we were able to build up a well-renowned knowledge management program, and something that I think helped the NASA workforce and helped them do their jobs better.
Right. So since you mentioned NASA, uh, so NASA is a world-renowned organization with hundreds of thousands of people working there. And when we talk about knowledge management, traditional sort of perspective on knowledge management is that it's something that needs to be done at an organization where there are tens of thousands of people or thousands of people, or it's a large organization. If you go by what people might think about where the use of knowledge management might come in. So my question, Roger, is how do you think about knowledge management when you're a CEO or a leader of a large organization, vis-a-vis a founder who's running a ragtag bunch of guys out of a garage and ladies as well, trying to build a company?
Well, the neat thing about knowledge for any organization is it's free. You have employees. You've trained them. You spent a lot of money and time training them, and over the years, they've trained themselves. They've learned how to do their job better than the owner of the company does, or even their immediate supervisor or manager does, because they do it every day, and they learn, the kind of inside scoop, ways to make their job more efficient and more effective. And that knowledge it's out there. And if you're the owner of a company or you're a manager of an organization, you have to realize that knowledge and that ability for someone to do their job well and efficiently and effectively is sitting right in front of you, and it's free. And if that person happens to leave or retire or move on to another company, which they do a lot of times because they gather this incredible amount of knowledge, and they go to another competitor and share that knowledge with the competitor. I think if you're an owner of a company, or no matter what size, or a manager of a group of folks, you have to realize that knowledge is just sitting there waiting for you to gather and be able to share it, and catalog it, so that the next person can come along and be able to step right into that job function without going through years and years of training to get it. And a lot of times what happens, and I've spoken to quite a few people at different government agencies and private companies, where they have a person that has done a fantastic job their whole career. They've gathered all this knowledge, but if they haven't shared it, and they haven't been asked to share it, they retire. And then all of a sudden the organization's looking at how are we going to get this job done? Nobody knows how to do this, or nobody certainly knows how to do it as well as the person has been doing it for the past 30 years. So they go out and hire the retiree back as a consultant. And then this one-time free information is now costing them probably twice as much as it did when they, before they lost this employee.
Roger, which gives me a very interesting follow-up question that you talk about, and I found it very interesting, which is you take inspiration from history
Yes.
in building knowledge management, and that was something that I didn't see, in many people who build knowledge management. And how do you see the connection between history and building a knowledge management uh, in an enterprise?
Well, I'll give you a little bit of my background. My first love is history. And my first college degree, I majored in history. And my father, I can remember when I told him I was going to major in history, he said, "Well, why would you do that? You can't. How are you going to find a job with a history degree?" And I thought, well, that's secondary. I love history and I want to learn history, and I'll think about a job later. And sure as heck, he was right. When after I graduated, I couldn't find a job. And it was at that point where I decided I have to go back. And I had a family at the time, and I had to, support a family. That I have to get a career going. So I went back to night school to get an engineering degree, and I happened to be lucky enough to get hired at NASA. But I was hired in at the lowest level. Came in as a apprentice technician, and what I had to do is the next 10 years continue to go to night school to earn my engineering degree, and then eventually a master's degree. But I always, at first when I started at NASA, I thought, wow, I just wasted 4 years of my life getting a history degree, and my father was right. And he spent all that money for me to get my history degree, and I can never use it. But as I moved on through NASA and became an engineer and started working on a project team and uh, started getting into training, become the chief knowledge officer at NASA, I realized how valuable my liberal arts degree was and how valuable my history degree was, because I could look at things from a different angle from a traditional technical minded person. Um, I think I could see questions and problems in a more uh, uh, global-like view, if you will, or a more diverse view. I could see it from different angles rather than just an engineer seeing things as, right and wrong, on or off, black or white. I could see things in more of a gray area, and that's what life is. I mean, engineers, when you're dealing with machinery and equipment, it is just a life. It is black and white, on, off, resistance, no resistance, that kind of thing. But in life and with people, it's not that way. And we're working on project teams and different personalities. I think having a history degree and a liberal arts degree gave me a great advantage moving up the ranks within NASA, because I could understand questions and problems a little bit more thoroughly, I think. So anyhow, with the history degree, when I first became the chief knowledge officer, it was like I was researching and doing some case studies, and I found myself, I'm actually being like a historian. I'm evaluating engineering problems and engineering disasters from a historian's point of view rather than from an engineering point of view. And I read this book. It was called Engineering in the Mind's Eye by Eugene Ferguson. And in there, he has a quote where he said, this kind of changed my whole attitude in knowledge management and dealing with people and dealing with teams and understanding engineers a little bit better. But he said, engineers need to be continually reminded that nearly all engineering failures result from faulty judgments rather than from faulty calculations. And our NASA engineers, they know their numbers, they know their math, they know their analytics, but it's the decision making. You have to determine, is the data you're receiving, is it good data? Is it correct data? Am I making the proper kind of judgment? And a lot of time an engineer will say, well, here's the data, boom, we'll make the decision. Well, there's a lot more hidden stuff behind the data that you got to pull out. And that's what a historian does. And it really, I realized once I became the chief knowledge officer and we were, doing case studies and kind of learning how to gain knowledge and then share knowledge, I realized I was actually using my history degree. And I wish so much my father was alive. Could I say, I finally used my history degree. It finally paid off.
No, which brings me to a very interesting point that you also make. You talk about some great history events being lost because the knowledge was not captured, right?
Yeah.
And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a very interesting perspective, which is almost bringing the soul to knowledge management, I would say. And I think that's a very interesting example. Can you share with us some historical events where probably knowledge was not captured and it just got lost, and that's something that all of us can learn from?
Oh, sure. The pyramids, you know, these were built thousands of years ago. They hadn't invented the pulley yet. How do they build these pyramids? And why don't we? It's not like we're going to build pyramids again, but we just want to understand, what kind of uh, technology they had and what kind of creativity and innovation that these folks had, that they were able to build pyramids that, frankly, right now, it would be a major project for everything that we have, all the machinery and the techniques and the civil engineering. It wouldn't be easy to build a pyramid. And these folks did it thousands of years ago without the use of a pulley. And that information was lost, and nobody knows why. And it's just, another issue thing is, and I was, again, like I said, history is my first love. So my free time, I like to read about history. And I was, excuse me, I was listening to a lecture on uh, uh, the plague in Europe during the 1500s and the 1600s and how it happened, and it completely transformed humanity. I think Europe lost over a third of its population, and with that, they lost a lot of knowledge. It ended up where, because of the way society was structured, you had guilds of shoemakers, guilds of farmers, guilds of leather people, and things like that. And then the plague would go through a town and wipe out this entire guild of shoemakers, and then 2 or 3 years later, nobody knows how to make a shoe, and they have to relearn all this. And another thing is calculus. Everybody now believes that Sir Isaac Newton was the inventor of calculus, but there's also the thought that there was a German mathematician decades before, or actually a century before Sir Isaac Newton, that had actually invented calculus, but he never shared it with anybody. They found some of his documents, later, decades or a century later, and found that, wow, he was doing calculus before Isaac Newton was. But he never shared the idea of calculus. He never published it. And then you have to get Sir Isaac Newton to come along almost a century later and reinvent something that somebody had already thought of. And they missed out on 100 years of possibility of using calculus in engineering and building and even in philosophical talk and discussions. So there's all kinds of, and I go through them in the book. Stonehenge is another one. The idea of Roman cement. If you go through Europe, go through Rome, and you see the Colosseum or any of the aqueducts, and you're like, my God, these things have been there for centuries. And then you try to drive on one of our roads that was just paved 2 or 3 years ago, and it's got chuck holes all over it. And you wonder what did they do differently? How can something like that still be surviving centuries later? And we were having so much difficulty. Well, the Romans had a certain recipe for their cement that enabled it to withstand variations in temperatures from the heat and cold. So it could expand and contract much better than the cement we have today. And we still don't really understand what that recipe was, and it was lost. The barbarians came in and sacked Rome. They sacked the libraries, they sacked the churches, or any place where there's depositories of knowledge were just wiped out. And they were, it affects us to this day.
Roger, while I was reading the book, you had this very interesting passage where you were saying that when you were getting into knowledge management, you had read many academic style books on knowledge management, but you found them very unnecessarily complicated and impractical. Uh, so I want to know, why did you feel this way? And you also made a very interesting point about the difference between a traditional text and a blueprint. So you were seeking blueprints, which is very interesting from an engineer's perspective. So can you talk a little bit about why did you not like the dry academic texts, and why were you seeking blueprints, and what's the benefit of a blueprint compared to a text?
Yeah, yeah. I was can't tell you how many different forums I attended to try to build up a background in knowledge management, and I would sit there and it would get into an academic discussion, and I'm not an academician. I'm an engineer, and I just want the information and the data. I want to consume it and absorb it and try to figure out and move forward and utilize that data. Well, I was getting a lot of data that I just didn't understand, and it's not that it's bad data, or it's not that somebody was trying to bombast me with superfluous knowledge or something like that. It was more of the fact that there's a place for academic research, and then there's a place for practical knowledge and getting a job done. And I have all the amount of respect for professors and folks in academia that are studying and moving the industry, the knowledge management industry, forward. But the kind of information I was getting from these sources would not interest the NASA workforce. The NASA workforce got a very difficult job. They're on the cutting edge of technology. They're given programs and projects to design and build. when the technology isn't even built yet or isn't even understood, and they're supposed to take that, they're supposed to move that project forward and develop and invent and create the technology as they're moving along in the project. So, I mean, that's a pretty intense way to make a living. And they come across different problems, and because people have been, we've had so many different programs and projects and understanding, like I said, we get the math right. It's very seldom we make a math error, but it's the decision-making process that we need to learn and build on. And I think that's where, with the NASA technical workforce needed a practical program, practical knowledge management program, not an academic one. They needed something where they can go to what we call our one-stop website, where if they have a question or they want to search the lessons learned database, they can do that. If they want to learn more about decision-making skills, they can sign up for a course on decision-making. There's just, we had to take this mountain of raw information and determine what the NASA technical workforce needs out of that mountain, and therefore just kind of filter it and come up with what we consider to be critical knowledge. And the first step in to do that is to determine who your audience is. And NASA has, we have 18,000 civil servants, so along with almost 60,000 contractors, and we have to kind of just determine of all those people who really moves NASA forward. And those are the engineers and the scientists on the program and project teams. So we didn't need to ignore the people in IT or ignore the people in international relations or ignore these hundreds of other groups within the agency, but we had to just kind of be realistic and say who's really important, who's moving NASA forward. And it is the people down in the trenches that are doing the work on the program and project teams. So once you determine who your audience is, and for us it was a NASA technical workforce, once you get that in place, determining how to siphon the enormous amount of information out there into critical knowledge becomes a whole lot easier.
Which brings me to a follow-up question, which is, I think you already touched upon it. Now, NASA has multiple programs in its portfolio. You have your Mars rover projects and your various probes and your jet engines. So I want to sort of know how was knowledge management integrated into these programs, and what kind of support were you receiving, and how did you really set it up, and what were some challenges you faced?
Well, we're very fortunate because NASA management understands the importance of knowledge management. And maybe it's because NASA management is made up of engineers, and engineers have been on project teams for 10, 20, 30 years, and they've been through the difficulties of making the same mistake that was made 2 years ago on another project on another center somewhere else, so I've always been had the benefit of having NASA management support. And also it was kind of there was a committee that was formed by the U.S. Congress to kind of oversee and advise NASA management on how to get some of these huge programs and projects moving forward. And one of their recommendations they came up with, and when a group that's appointed by Congress comes up with a recommendation, it's pretty much something you better look into and you better do. And they came up with a recommendation about almost 10 years ago that NASA needs to concentrate on knowledge management and learn to share knowledge among the workforce. So when you have that kind of support, it makes my job a lot easier, because as any project manager knows, you're not going to, the most important thing you need initially on a project is upper management support. If you don't have that, you're not going to go forward. So I was fortunate enough to have that kind of support. And as far as every NASA program and project also has a requirement that they have to provide lessons learned when the program or project is over. So it's kind of, it's not always followed. It's not always followed as well as it should be. But that became part of my job, to make sure the program and projects understood the value of knowledge management, and rather than shove something down their throat, made it more of a two-way street where we interacted and collaborated. They understood the value of it when I was able to, to talk to them about the real value of knowledge management, and how it's not just an unnecessary bureaucratic process that they have to go through at the end of their program or the project, but it's actually a valuable learning lesson for everybody on their project team. And in the end, it not only can save a lot of engineering headaches and trying to figure out how to do something or why something went wrong, but it can actually save you a lot of money. Let somebody else make the mistake and learn from it, and that you don't have to pay for that mistake that somebody else has already paid for.
So, Roger, one of the things that you talk about is this Apollo 1 Challenger Columbia projects, which triggered the importance of knowledge management in NASA. And you also talk about a very deep connection between how knowledge management also transforms culture, right?
Exactly.
I've never, at least heard it in forums, because culture change and knowledge management is a very interesting correlation that you talk about. So, talk to me about how did the culture change happen? Because in some places, you really talk about the fact that people don't even speak up when they know it's a mistake, right? So, therefore, I really thought it was a very interesting point that you made, the importance of building culture and having a very deep connection with knowledge management.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest benefits knowledge management can bring to an organization is it gives you the flexibility, and it empowers you to change a culture that may need changing. And in NASA's case, NASA came into being at the beginning, the Cold War, and after the Russians launched Sputnik, and then the whole American government and the American people were thought, oh my God, we're so far behind. And President Kennedy sets a goal. We could barely get a rocket up in the air. And all of a sudden he sets a goal that we're going to land a man on the moon and return him safely to the earth. And my God, think if you're a NASA engineer and you have all of a sudden you have the President of the United States telling the entire world that you're going to land somebody on the moon, and you're just starting out. And I think NASA developed, and you have to in a situation like that, you develop more of a military-like culture where, NASA was given the resources, they were given plenty of money. Back in the 60s during the Apollo program, the NASA budget was 4.4% of the United States budget. That's a huge amount. Today, it's only 0.4% of the United States budget. So Americans spend more money on pizza every year than they do on their space program, or even dog food. So, but back then, the culture at NASA became, we got to get this done one way or another, and they push things through. We're going to make mistakes, but push things through, because we got to get a man on the moon before the end of the decade. And that kind of culture developed into what you were talking about. People were afraid to talk about mistakes, because your whole vision is to move forward, and you can't make mistakes, or if you do, you certainly don't want to publicize them. And I think it came to a head. It came certainly with a Challenger tragedy. That shuttle, and again, it was not a analytical or a numbers equation that somebody messed up. It was a decision-making process that somebody, NASA management, made the mistake, and it was publicized. There was a presidential commission that reviewed it, and everything was public, and NASA promised that that they're going to change their ways, and it's not going to happen again. And they pretty much kind of, I think a perfect example is what they did with the Challenger debris once they recovered it from the ocean, is they buried it in a missile silo and covered it with a huge cement block so that nobody could ever see it, or it was just kind of like, shoving it under the rug and forgetting about it. Let's move forward. And within a certain amount of time, they went right back to the same old kind of, culture that was successful in the past in getting to the moon, but all of a sudden times have changed, and that's not the kind of culture an organization needs during the shuttle program. And then once again, Columbia happened. Again, this was not a math error. It was a decision-making error, and had to do with the foam strike. The wing of the Columbia and the aftermath tragedy of that. And this, and again, there was a President Bush at the time convened another presidential commission to study and figure out why. And again, it was the same reason. And in the report, they came back and said that NASA just continually makes these same type of decision-making mistakes, and NASA has to reform. And this time, people were fired. People were, moved to other jobs. And I think NASA took much more responsibility for it. And they implemented, certain programs to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And one is called technical authority. And technical authority, it basically allows, if somebody's on a project team and they have a question, whether it be an engineering design issue that they're not comfortable with, or maybe a project manager makes a health and safety issue that they're not comfortable with, well, they have right now they of course they bring it up to the project manager, and if this person still doesn't come into an agreement with the project manager, it can go a step further, and NASA will bring in a subject matter expert to review that question. And the subject matter expert isn't paid by the project or the program. It's a totally objective person that comes in and reviews the request. And if the engineer on the project team still has some issues and wants to take it higher, it can go to the center director. It can go all the way to the NASA administrator. And it can go to the NASA chief engineer, who happened to be my boss when I was the NASA Chief Knowledge Officer, to review it, and then it can go to the administrator. So there's a process in place that if somebody wants to make a decision that involves the health and safety or the a program or project, you have alternatives. You just a project manager just can't say no. We're doing it my way, or my way or the highway. That doesn't happen anymore. And that's has to do with the dissenting opinion, where and this is when we started our knowledge management program, and this is how we helped change NASA's culture, is we took the ball and ran with it when it came to technical authority and dissenting opinion. We incorporated that into our courses so that every NASA engineer understood exactly, health and safety and the success of a mission or a project. That's an engineer's responsibility, and ethical responsibility, and that you have to talk up. If you're uncomfortable with something, we want you to be comfortable speaking about it and not afraid to speak up. And so we make sure that we integrate that type of information into almost all our courses. And I think what the most fundamental thing we did, and again, I'm not trying to claim that our knowledge management program changed NASA's culture, but we helped change NASA's culture. The only way you're going to change NASA's culture is upper management says, we're starting a new way. And they did that when they came up with the tech authority and the dissenting opinion. But what we did to even demonstrate this further to the NASA workforce is and like I said, we incorporated this in our courses. We developed case studies that make sure that this is prominent. But we came up with what we call the Columbia Tour. And NASA has 10 engineering centers throughout the country. And what we did is we brought some of the debris from the Columbia. And let me back up a little bit. After I mentioned with Challenger, that debris was buried. With the Columbia debris, that was taken and put almost into a museum-like setting in the vehicle in the VAB building at the Kennedy Space Center. And every NASA engineer, if they get a chance to go to the Kennedy Space Center, is encouraged to go through there. And it's really a very somber experience. I've been through there a couple of times, and our knowledge management program helps fund this Columbia Museum. And when you come out of there, it's almost like you've been through a wake or a funeral. You're really, you can see the landing gear, and it's still dripping red hydraulic fluid, and there's a pan underneath it. This is years and years later, and you can see the windows from at the front of the shuttle, the frames that were just found, And then you realize that these are the windows that the astronauts looked out of, the last moments of their life when they're coming into deorbit. And there was also some personal effects of some of the astronauts that are on a table. And I'll never forget, there was one little, like a teddy bear, like that I assume one of the astronauts' children, or it must have been a good luck charm or something, that a child somewhere gave one of the astronauts, and the astronaut took it aboard the shuttle. And there it is, sitting there on a table with some other personal effects that were found with the astronauts. So it's any engineer that walks through there comes away with the idea that my job's important. I have to do my job well, because I don't want to see this happen. And the shuttle was just a piece of machinery, but it held 7 wonderful people on it that lost their lives that day, and 7 families that mourned, an entire nation that was upset by the tragedy. And your specific job on a project team might not seem that important, but when you look at the possibilities of something that you're designing or something that you're assembling could go wrong and could cause a tragedy, you have to really it puts a deeper aspect or deeper meaning into your job. And we wanted to convey that. And we realized that most of the NASA workforce can't get to the Kennedy Space Center and can't get, when you have 18,000 civil servants, 60,000 contractors, you're not going to get them all through the Columbia room where the debris is on display. So we decided to take the debris to the centers, and we brought some of the parts of the Columbia that were recovered, put them in a display case. We went to the centers and we held a forum, almost a 2 or 3 hour forum, where we invite the entire center to participate. And we had great participation. There were 300, 400, 500 people come into an auditorium, not just to see the artifacts from the shuttle tragedy, but also we brought in speakers. And the first one was really incredible. We brought in the widow of one of the astronauts that was on the Challenger, or on the Columbia rather. And she said she just gave the most inspiring type of talk. And she still, despite what happened to her husband, she's still part of the NASA family. And as part of the NASA family, she wants to do everything she can to make sure something like this never happens again to a NASA astronaut and the NASA astronaut's family, and to the entire NASA workforce family. And she just gave a wonderful talk about what what it meant to have her husband be an astronaut, what it meant to see him training, and how much he loved the agency and how much he loved his job, and then also the effect of the tragedy had on her and her family and children growing up. So, and then we bring in people who are at mission control during the monitoring the Columbia as it came into deorbit, and what their experiences was, and we brought in people that were actually part of the recovery team that went out to Texas to comb through all the swamps and everything like that to try to discover or to try to recover some of the shuttle debris that had landed out there. And I think what we wanted to make sure we did was bring the human aspect to the Columbia tragedy. Everybody knows, from an engineering standpoint, we all know what happened, and it's not that difficult, and it's not that complex. But the difficult and the complex thing is the human aspect to it, and the human aspect to your job, and how critical your job is. And like I said, the NASA culture changed from one of hiding the debris from the Challenger and moving on and moving forward, to one of openly talking about it, making sure that every NASA engineer is aware of it, and actually bringing that debris out to the workforce and letting them see what happens when your job isn't done correctly. What happens when an engineer doesn't speak up in a meeting where he or she feels it's something, there's a potential for a risk happening that needs to be mentioned. And again, it's the whole idea of helping and enabling NASA management to change a culture to one that's more transparent, and one where the opinions and the attitude of the NASA workforce is critical and important to them. And actually, isn't that what knowledge management is about? I mean, knowledge sharing, isn't that what it's the heart of it is really about? Um, Changing a culture, whether it be on a project team or within an entire organization. It's about making something better. And I'm real proud of the effect that our knowledge management team had at NASA and helping NASA management do that.
Brilliant story, Roger. Brilliant story, and to me, this evoked, I would say, uh, pictures in my head as you spoke. I think that's really how this conversation and the story that you said was very interesting. The one question that I have, Roger, is one is the human aspect, the other is the rational engineering aspect, right? So therefore, how do you connect both? Because there's an emotional, effect on knowledge management that happened, and then there is this whole engineering design aspect, which is extremely rational. So how do you really connect both? Because people then have to connect it for what you really talk about, which is not about return on investment, but it is return on mission success, right? So
Exactly.
therefore, how do you really connect both?
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think whenever you're having a knowledge management program, or you're starting one, or certainly when you're trying to defend one, everybody in management is a bean counter. Accountant come back, well, I mean, how's this helping? How are we going to, how's this going to save us money, or how's this going to help us make more money? And it's the same thing with training. You can't say, well, if this engineer attends this course, it's going to increase his or her efficiency by 20%. You're going to save, you know, $20,000 on your program. Well, there are no analytics for that, and because again, you're dealing with the humans. It's not machines, and they you have to consider that aspect. So I've been told countless times, well, how much, how much is training saving us? How much? And everybody's trying to, when budgets are tight, everybody's trying to pull money from everybody else, and they're always looking, okay, we can cut human resources, we can cut training, and that kind of stuff. So you have to be able to come prepared to defend your budget. And with us, we realized that I can't come up with a number of return on investment, or somebody else. Okay, if we buy from this supplier, we're going to save 10%. That's going to save us $50,000 to build this project. Well, I can't do that, but I can come back and talk about return on mission success. And the idea about that is people and our courses. Gosh, we are. I think we help over 100 courses a year, and usually they're 2 or 3 days, and they're we try to limit them to 30, 25, 30 people, something like that. So the NASA workforce is interested in learning. Engineers enjoy learning. They understand that they have to continually learn in order to grow in their field and in their career. But when we looked at the training, I can't, like I said, I can't come back with a number, but I can come back and say I can do a survey. People that have taken our course, talk to them, have them do a survey before they step into the room. How are you efficient or deficient in these certain areas that the course is going to talk about? And then afterwards, they take the course. Same thing, a survey. Did you learn more in this area? Were you able to increase your knowledge in this area? Do you feel more comfortable making decisions in this area? And that's kind of the raw data that I can get from them. And that's useful. But the other thing that we did is we waited a month after somebody took a course. And we contacted either the project manager that they were working for or their immediate supervisor and said, have you noticed a difference in this employee after they're taking our course or attending one of our forums or attending a case study lecture? And have you noticed that they I think one of the important courses that we used to teach was communication skills. And I think engineers are known at not being the most communicative of folks. And I'm not trying to generalize or anything like that, but hey, I've worked with engineers for 40 years, and I know that sometimes they have a hard time expressing themselves or even a willingness to express themselves. So one of our most popular courses was about communication. And communication can be not just orally speaking to somebody, but also written communication, which is critical. And so we try to teach engineers how to communicate more effectively with other engineers and with their management, with their program within their programs and projects. So after a course like that, then we'd contact the person's manager or supervisor, say, have you noticed a difference in, have you, in the emails you receive from this employee, does it appear that they've, making some headway in learning how to communicate more effectively? And that, again, that's more data and more information I can give to my management, just, not only to let them know the progress we're making, but again, when somebody tries to come in and cut your budget, say, well, we're not getting a return on investment, I can come back and say, well, here's all this data. All your engineers are coming back telling me, yeah, they're feeling more confident because they took this course. They feel more confident they can get their job done right and correctly. And not only that, their managers are feeling that they also are improving as a program or project team member. And to me, that's some pretty valuable information that I can use. And I can proudly say that as a chief knowledge officer for about 5 years, I didn't take one budget cut because I was able to come back and at least be prepared for the conversation. And there's no way I can analytically tell you that training. Everybody knows that training helps, but you can't come back and put a number on it. But I can come back and give you some useful information that the person who took the course, the people on the project team that the person works with have noticed improvement, and the person's manager has known an improvement. So what we call that is return on mission success.
Roger, I want to take you back in time a little bit. So, towards this, at the beginning of the conversation, you said that you finished your history degree and then you transitioned into a life and career as an engineer. So, a question that I have, Roger, is what was the transition like? So, you were used to studying history and the liberal arts, and as you moved into engineering, what were those days like? Brushing back up your math and building your skills forward in math, and finally, what were some lessons that you picked up back in those days that have stuck with you to this day? So, what is that experience like?
Those are great questions. And like I mentioned earlier, history is my first love, and it still is. In my spare time, I don't sit down with an engineering book or a calculus manual or anything like that. I sit down with a history book and thoroughly enjoy it. I can remember it was kind of very demoralizing, actually, when I went to a very good college to get my history degree, and you can't find can't find a job, and people don't really care. What can you bring to me? And unfortunately, it finally sunk in after that, where I couldn't find a decent job, and I realized, I have to provide something. I provide a service to an employer where I can help them and help them grow and help them become more successful. And it was like I said, it was demoralizing to go from having a undergraduate degree in liberal arts and history, and then start at the very bottom at NASA, running a lathe. And people, they come up to me and say, "Why did you major in history?" And actually, I had a performance review while I was still an apprentice, and I'll never forget it. I went into this. My managers. We used to do 3-month rotations throughout, so you could get to learn, the center you're working at, and get to know the network with the people, and get to learn the different jobs at the center. So this certain rotation, I had my performance review with the supervisor, and he asked me a little bit about my background. I said, well, actually, I have a undergraduate degree in history. He looked at me and says, "Oh, I'm real sorry about that." And I thought, oh. And I was kind of taken back. I said, "Well, why are you sorry about that?" He goes, "Well, I mean, you spent all that money, or your dad spent all that money, and you're not even, you'll never use it." And I was, I was. He's another one that I'd like to talk to again and say, "Hey, here I did end up using my history degree, but and I was after that, I would be embarrassed to talk to people, that I was working with. That I have a history, and even engineers. Engineers are so practical minded. I get to know an engineer as a friend and an ISO technician, and get to know their background, and share my background. And it was always the same thing. Why did you major in history? I mean, and it just, to an engineer, it doesn't make sense for me to come back and say, "Well, I love history. I wanted to learn more about history." But engineers, and that kind of mindset, and it's not just engineers, but it's more like, well, what were you thinking? I mean, what were you going to use that degree for? And for me, it was just like, well, wasn't thinking that way. I was thinking about what can I learn about the world, and that's what interests me. So it was almost embarrassing after a while, and I didn't want to even talk about my history degree. But I realized that once I got graduated through my apprenticeship, and then I went back to school and went to get an engineering degree, and that wasn't easy because I was never real good at math, and I had to start all over again. Trust me, I don't have the same love for math as I do for history. It's just not that interesting. But I had this mindset, well, I have to provide for my family. I have to do something with my life. The world doesn't care too much about history degrees. They care a lot about engineering degrees. And I just, sucked it up and went back to, like I said, 10 years of night school. And asked me, if there's a kind of a lesson learned that I have personally from that experience. And that is, I guess, two things. One is never give up. Never give up on yourself. There were times when I was going to night school. I can remember one time in particular, it was snowing and my car wouldn't start. And I finally got it. And I think I had a test that evening. And I'm driving there and my car stalls on the way and I'm going to be late. And I was thinking to myself, it's snowing outside. It's miserable. I have a family back home. I have a job. It's 9:30 at night and I'm stuck on the side of the highway. Maybe I should just give up. And I've had that several times. There's several times when I was like calculus in particular, where I just couldn't figure out a problem. And I just didn't feel adequate. And I was thinking to myself, or thermodynamics, that's another course. Trust me, if you want to if you want to read something interesting, go to history, not thermodynamics, at least in my case. But that was another course that I had so much trouble with. And I thought, I don't have the makings of an engineer. But I had the support of my family, and I also had the support of NASA management to go back to school. I think they respected me, and NASA's a great place to work. And all through my early career, there were times when there was one particular time when I worked at the hangar, and we were working on airplanes, and all the airplanes took off, and my manager asked me, I said, "What do you want me to do?" And he says, "Well, I mean, there's nothing here really to work on." He said, "How's your school going?" I said, "Well, we got our finals next week." He said, "I'll tell you what, the pilot's room is empty. They're all out flying their airplanes for a couple hours. I want you to get your books and go in there and study and prepare yourself for your test." And that's some great support. And I had the same thing at home. We had 4 children. We were raising them. My wife was always supportive of me going to night school. And so, like I said, the biggest lesson learned for me was never give up. And I guess the other thing is, if you don't underestimate a liberal arts degree, even an organization like NASA, because when I got into management, or I got to be the chief knowledge officer, I used my liberal arts degree almost exclusively. I've hardly ever used my engineering degree once you got into management. And I think my liberal arts degree gave me a huge advantage over a lot of other people that just had an engineering degree and they were moved into management, because they didn't really understand the people aspect of it. And they didn't understand, how to get the best out of a person. And it's not, just ramming things down their throat and just throwing data at them and having them come up with it's learning more about people and how people function. And I think one of the biggest advantages I had at an organization like NASA, because everybody's an engineer, was that I had my liberal arts background and that I could look at things from a different angle than most folks could.
Wow. I mean, Roger, I think this is the 23rd episode that we have been recording, and I think that is by far one of the most amazing answers I've ever heard ever since I've been a part of this journey. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Roger. So since we spoke about lessons learned, I want to sort of take it in a parallel direction and ask about the lessons learned database that you managed to set up, right? And I want to know, where did this idea for the lessons learned database come up from? How would you go about instituting it? And what's the real value behind looking at that kind of a database?
I think the lessons learned database. Well, before I get started, I want to make sure your listeners understand the difference between a lessons learned and a case study. With a lessons learned database, it's completely practical, completely pragmatic. It's usually about for example, fasteners. Uh, Somebody at one of the centers purchased 1,000 fasteners and started to install them into their equipment, and all of a sudden discovered that those fasteners don't meet specifications. So you get on a lessons learned database and you put a note in there, warning anybody else who's having problems with fasteners or who's looking at purchasing fasteners, to give them a little bit of a heads up that there's a problem there. And so the lessons learned database is full of that kind of information. Practical, usable, something that somebody on a project team, it usually is looking for something that revolves around equipment. With a case study, it's more about decision making, and it goes into a problem a little bit more in depth. And I think at the back of my book, I give an example of a case study, and it has to do with the Concord, the flight of the Concord, and the series of events that happened in that it almost seemed unimaginable how there was somebody adjusting or replacing the cowling on a jet engine at the Houston airport. This plane, and he didn't do a real good job of it. And this plane landed at Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport and took off, and this part fell off, and then the Concord was overfilled with fuel, and it came, and then all of a sudden the usual FOD, the cleaning up of the tarmac, those processes were put on hold because the people were in training. All of a sudden you have this overfilled Concord, hits the strip, busts the tire hits the underbelly of the Concord, starts this huge fire. Well, it's all unpredictable, and there's no, that's not a lessons learned. You can't put in the database, don't put this piece apart on a cowling this way or something like that. But it's a case study that helps an engineer understand that a program and a project and issues like this, they're a system, and everything's, if one part of that system all of a sudden doesn't work, it has a domino effect on the other parts that can cause a tragedy, a catastrophe like that. So anyhow, that's the difference between a lessons learned and a database. Lessons learned is much more simple, practical. Boom, boom, boom. It is basically a database, like an Excel spreadsheet. And again, the lessons learned database was something that was told, the federal government had NASA develop a lessons learned database. But one of the problems was, when I became the chief knowledge officer, is that every NASA center has their own database. Some of the big projects have their own database. Some of the databases are behind firewalls. What sense does that make? You're gathering information, then hiding it from everybody. So, what we tried to do is look at all these different databases, and we came up with what we call as a one-stop shop website, where a NASA engineer can go there. He or she doesn't have to go on one center's website, search through their database, and go to another center, find their URL, and find out where their database is. And all they have to do is go to our website, and everything's gathered for you. And you can you can search. It makes it so much easier, and it makes all the different databases that are out there much more available to all the different engineers, rather than, their life is busy. They don't have time to go searching through dead URLs to find, looking for information. It gets so frustrating. So what I had our team do is just gather all that information into one source, one spot, so that an engineer can easily access it, or not only access it, but also add lessons learned into a database. And actually, And I mentioned this earlier, as far as communication skills, a lot of engineers, on project teams, they're either too busy to sit down and write a lessons learned. They'll see a problem and think, well, yeah, I'll file that to the back, and maybe I'll write a lessons learned thing into the database at a later date, and then they forget about it, or they don't like writing. It's just engineers are so much more comfortable with numbers than they are with letters and words and writing. So what we did was offer, if somebody's on a project team and they see something that needs, whether it be a lessons learned or a database, we have technical writers on staff. Contact us, just send us the information, and we'll research it, and we'll enter that into the database, or maybe even we'll build a case study around it.
Brilliant, Roger. Uh, I think one point that you've been making through this conversation is really the importance of cognitive biases when taking a decision. Uh, Walk me through the cognitive biases and the real problems of taking decisions and how it affects decision making.
Oh yeah, cognitive biases, and we developed a whole curriculum around decision making, and cognitive biases is certainly one of our most pertinent, and also one of our most popular courses that we offer. And again, I think this is coming from a more liberal arts background, where you realize that again, I'll go back to that Eugene Ferguson quote, that engineers, they have to be reminded that engineering tragedies and disasters are seldom cause of somebody faulty calculations. All our engineers really know their math when they come out of college. They know what they're doing as far as math goes, but it's the decision-making process and what's involved with that. And you can go into and this happens countless times. You go into a situation where you might not even realize, but you've already made up your mind. You've gathered people together for a meeting. You're leading the meeting. You'll go around. What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? But you're wasting everybody's time, because you might not even realize it. But in the back of your mind, you thought about this and you've already come up with a decision. And unless somebody comes up with some earth-shattering data that you never saw before, the decision's already been made. And just to make people realize that and it's not easy. You have to be open-minded, and you also have to, and this is something that's been stressed at NASA quite a bit, and that's having a diverse project team. If you have all engineers on your team, they're all going to come up with the same opinion or the same decision almost all the time. But if you have somebody that has a different background, and they look at it from a different angle and say, well, yeah, you can do that, but further down the road that might be a problem. For example, when they're designing, even when they were designing the space shuttle, and for the Challenger early on, and you're tight with a budget and things like that, but they designed the O-ring for the external boosters with only one backup, so that if one O-ring burned through, and they knew that there was going to be a problem because there's a lot of heat temperature in there, and you don't know, the thermal expansion of the O-rings and the aluminum around it, things like that are going to happen. But they only had the funding for putting one backup O-ring in there, and the joint that they designed, they knew it was problematic, but they have a schedule that has to be met, and they only have a certain amount of funding, and so they made a less than adequate design on the the shuttle boosters, and they knew it, and there was really nothing they could do about it at the time, or they felt that at the time. But when something like that happens early on in a project, you think, okay, it meets the requirements, it meets the specifications, but if there is a problem further down the line, well, we've just designed something early on that's going to be here for the next 10 years, because they're going to continually keep making it this part or this system in the same way. And early on in a decision making, a faulty decision early on in a designing project can have repercussions years and years down the road, and that's what happened with the Challenger. So make sure that people understand this, and I think the best way when you're teaching engineers about decision making and bias and decision making is to come up with case studies and realize that I know one of the case studies we have, the lesson learned from that case study, Rad, is that sometimes no data is better than false data. And when you're making a decision, and if you're going on false data, you're gonna just multiply the problem. But sometimes you're better off not having the data at all, so that you're thinking, oh my gosh, what if this happens, if this happens, if this happens, if this happens. If you have false data, you're thinking, well, it can only happen this way, so I'm gonna go down this road. So those are the kind of things that we stress, and I think they're critical things that knowledge management should stress in any organization is. And it doesn't just apply to engineers, having cognitive biases in their decision making. It applies to accountants. It applies to any medical services, anything that you have to. And it's not easy, but at least you have to be aware of it when you're making a decision.
Since knowledge management is also an aspect of learning where there's a lot of documentation required. You spoke about the services of technical writers across the board for folks to actually leverage and get their cases written, etc., etc. Right. So my question to you, Roger, is that when you have a documentation-intensive environment, communication is a very critical skill when you're actually writing your documents. So, given your experience over at NASA, can you tell us about what's the structure of a great document, and what are some principles that a writer should follow to ensure that knowledge is captured, knowledge is accurately shared, and it's in context to the problem that they're trying to solve?
I think one of the areas, and we recognize this, is that there's a lot of fascinating things happening out at NASA in these different programs and projects, and there's case studies out there, and and in our courses, when you're displaying a case study to a group of engineers, someone in the audience is bound to come up and say, yeah, something similar happened to us on this program or project, or not only, your case study is interesting, but hey, I have this case, we have this situation in our program that is just incredible. And then what you try to do is, well, okay, again, that information's out there, that knowledge is out there. How do I gather it? And not only how do I gather it, how do I kind of share this knowledge? One of the resources we came up with was we came up with a case study workshop for NASA for the NASA workforce, and basically, we advertise on our website. If you have an interesting story to tell, come to this workshop. Come prepared. Come with your proposed case study and the data and the information you have about it, and we'll have a professional case study writer sit with you, talk to you about it, help you write it, and then if it's, first of all, they'll judge it. Well, is this really a case study, or is this a lesson learned? Is this something that is going to help the NASA technical workforce, or is it just kind of noise on the outside? Determine the value of it, and then if it is something that we think will help the NASA workforce, we'll work with that person. And what we're trying to do is, and it's a little bit different from the lessons learned where we have a technical writer that's going to do it for you. We want to teach the NASA engineers and the NASA technical workforce how to write a case study. First of all, first, I guess, how to recognize what is a valuable case study, and then how to write it. And of course, we'll come in with the editors and things like that to help polish it up. But it also incorporates in the back of a engineer, a project team member, a kind of culture where they're looking for case studies, where they're looking beyond just the hardware, where they're looking at ways that that could make that hardware better, or that program project more efficient and more effective. And case studies and storytelling are two great ways of doing that, because that really sticks with an engineer. If you look at I think that's the real value of a case study, and particularly the value of storytelling. That it brings it home. It makes it human, and it's rather than just going through pages and pages of data and information. It brings a human aspect into it, something that you can relate to, and it makes you kind of when you talk about a case study, and almost all case studies revolve around engineering disasters or mishaps. So when you bring the human experience into that, when you have, particularly if you have somebody that made a faulty decision, made a bad decision, having the courage to get up in front of a group and say, here's the best mistake I made. And you say it's the best mistake because I learned from it. And I want to share that with my cohorts and my fellow engineers at NASA so I learned it once, and it only cost the organization for this one mistake. So you don't repeat this mistake, and it ends up costing the organization, 2 or 3 times down the road for the same mistake. And, to see a person get up there in front of people and talk honestly and openly about it. Again, it's part of changing the NASA culture to make people understand mistakes happen, and they're always going to happen. But the real benefit is teaching people about it and learning from it, so that particular mistake doesn't happen again, or at least people are aware of it.
In this increasingly digital world, where you can learn anything on any digital platforms, there is a view that you have, which I thought was extremely, you know, I would say, very vivid for me, in terms of, how you expressed it. Where do you use e-learning, and where should you use in-person learning? Because today, it's touted as, you just get somewhere, get into a platform, you'll start learning anything, right? So therefore, how do you really distinguish between what can you e-learn and what can you in-person learn? How do you distinguish it in terms of, not only capturing knowledge but absorbing the knowledge, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's a tough question, but that question was answered during the pandemic, because all of a sudden, before the pandemic, all of our courses were in person. We hired an instructor, subject matter expert, to come in and for 3 days sit down with 30 NASA engineers and talk to them and interact with them. And then the pandemic happened, and I thought, oh my God, we have to convert 100 courses into e-learning real quick, or we're going to be out of business. The agency will have no use for us. But I told our team that I wanted to do this the right way. First of all, I want you to comb through our courses and discover which ones are really capable of being e-learning, and then concentrate on those. If there's some courses, like we have an international project management course where we invite people from other space agencies, European Space Agency, the German Space Agency, the Italian, Korean, Japanese organization. Twice a year, they come to the Kennedy Space Center. And that is definitely interactive. And one of the primary ideas for that, so a week-long course, is to get people to network between the different agencies so that they understand the culture of other agency and how projects are run at another agency. Because there's, in the future, going back to the moon, it's going to be with the cooperation of the Indian Space Agency, the Japanese Space Agency, the Canadian, everybody, because it's a huge project. So a course like that, unfortunately, we had to cancel. And we haven't held it since the pandemic, because we would be doing those folks a disservice if we tried to do it virtually online. But there's other courses that we were able to work with the instructors and come up with a plan. And first, well, there was a lot of hiccups. We were using Zoom, and just same kind of type of hiccups we had at the beginning of this conversation, where how do I log into this? And there's so many different platforms out there. We had to settle on a certain platform, but we were able to to get past those problems and fix things, and it worked out real well. But I can tell you one thing: before the pandemic and when all our courses were in person, I never had one person come up to me, one engineer or one student of our courses come up to me and say, boy, I really wish this was online. I really, prefer training online, because they realize the real value of having a subject matter expert at their availability for 3 days to really that one-on-one contact with someone and to talk to them and really delve into it much deeper, and not have to, worry about, distractions when you're on your computer. If you're in your office or even in your home, working on your computer at online learning, the cat knocks something off a table, and all of a sudden you're over there fixing it, and you come back and you're lost, and the course is, pretty much a waste for you. But I had a lot of managers in the past come up with these great ideas. Why don't you put everything online? And that'll save us tons of money. And you won't have to pay these subject matter experts to come in and teach, and just videotape them and put it up online, and we'll be done with it. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. Is that a lot of the subject matter experts, they do that for a living, and trying to convince them to, hey, how about I videotape this and then show it to everybody for free for the rest of for the next 10 years, it doesn't go over real well. They're not willing to do that. And the second thing is that information and coursework, it changes, and if you have something that's online, all of a sudden you have to re-edit it and go back or pull something out or go back and try to add something to it. And it actually becomes more time consuming. If it's an in-person course, you just notify the instructor, okay, NASA's moving on from this systems engineering style to this new one, and here's some of the charts for you. And if you have any questions, talk to us and we'll explain it to you. But if it's already, written, it's already performed on the videotape, well, you got to find people with the technical expertise to go in there and edit it, and then you got to go back out and try to refilm it. And it just, to me, it became too bothersome. But I'm not totally saying that online learning isn't good. There's certainly aspects for online learning that are a benefit, but I think some of the in-depth courses where you want to collaborate and you want network and you want to talk to one of the leading experts in the world about a situation, there's nothing better than in person. I tell you, one of the real benefits of virtual learning is podcasts, and that's particularly with a younger generation. I remember my deputy came up with this idea. He said, why don't we start doing a podcast? I understand there's a lot of younger NASA engineers that, on their breaks and stuff like that, they just tune in on their phone or on their commute. They'll listen to a podcast. And at first I thought, I'm a little bit old school maybe, but I thought, I didn't know they do podcasts anymore. And obviously I had to be taught quite a bit. I said, okay, we'll give it a try. We'll see, what the NASA workforce is like. Oh my gosh, the podcasts were amazingly popular. I mean, and our podcast and most of our information, even most of our lessons learned database is available to anybody in the world. Our podcasts are, that's the cool thing about NASA. It's very transparent. We don't deal with a whole lot of super secret stuff, but we're an organization that wants to make sure we can share the kind of knowledge that we have with other organizations. And NASA, I think, does a great job of that. But with the podcasts, they're available on iTunes. They're available right from our website. We're getting 20,000 hits, that kind of stuff from all around the world. Because NASA is a name brand. I mean, almost everybody on the planet knows about NASA, or is interested in space, and NASA is the place to go to. So I was just overwhelmed, and it really is a phenomenal tool for training and learning.
Roger, I have a question based on a comment that he had made in your book, which is, in 1966, NASA's budget went from $100 million to $6 billion. It was almost 4.5% of the federal budget. That's what you state in your book. Today, it's 1/2 of 1%. And as you have mentioned earlier in our conversation, that Americans spend more on pet food and pizza than their space program. So when we look at the future, that we had the 60s had a very definite view of what deterministic and a definite view of what the future should look like, where you have to put a man on the moon, and there were significant financial investments and technical developments that were made based on that vision. And what do you think that in today's environment, where it is less than 1%, what does that actually represent in terms of America's space endeavors and its ambitions, and What's the temperature that you get from this sort of federal funding decision that's coming, or the trend that preceded it?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, the American public loves NASA. Of all the different agencies and components of the United States federal government, I think NASA has by far the best reputation because we do interesting stuff. We do stuff that, for a lay person, a non-technical person, must seem like, a miracle. Yeah. When you're in an airplane and you're looking out and you're 3 miles up in the sky, you think, how in the heck have they got this thing that weighs tons of metal flying up here? Why aren't we falling? Or just your computer, your TV, everything. It must seem like really like a miracle to a layperson how it works. And I think because of that, people have a lot of respect for NASA. How do you get somebody to the moon? How do you build a supersonic airplane? And how do you build these probes that go up all the way to Pluto to take pictures? They're flying at this unbelievable speed, 30,000 kilometers per hour, taking 4 or 5 years to get to Pluto at that speed, and then photographing it as you fly by it. I mean, how do you do that? And so NASA has a lot of goodwill, and we've had a lot of we've had some issues and we've had some problems, but I think we've been open and honest about them. And as far as the funding for NASA, I think I would say in the past probably 8 years, the funding is NASA not only NASA, I think the federal government and the politicians in particular wanted to see a return to the moon. And the first time we did it, it was forced and it was part of the Cold War. This time, I think they want to do it for a number of reasons, and scientific reasons are one of it. And rather than just land on the moon and come back and never go, spend 50 years before you go back, they want to have a permanent base on the moon or permanent human activity on the moon. And they've discovered frozen water that they'd be able to utilize. And I think the overall goal is to utilize that frozen water and extract the hydrogen from it and actually launch, a man, flights from the moon to Mars, because the gravity on the gravity on the moon is so much less, 1/6 that is on the Earth. So it's much easier, and you require much less fuel to launch from the moon to Mars. But obviously there's all kinds of technological issues in doing that. But I think that we have the ear of the politicians now, and I think they're interested in that. And I think there's, not only for scientific reasons, but I think there's also, the international challenges we have with the Chinese and their space program, and they're making some, obviously some major headway in their space program. So I think there's, a little bit of a competitive factor in doing that. So I think in about probably the last 8 years or so, the NASA budget has been robust. I think they're very rational and try to be logical on how much money they give NASA or they give any organization, because they want to make sure that the money's well spent. And that's where knowledge management can come in handy, because like I said in the book, our budget for knowledge management, and again, it has to do with the butterfly effect. It's only $10 million, and we train we have to train 18,000 civil servants, and we have to make sure that knowledge is shared, and we have to make sure that money is well spent and allocated correct resources, and that we're fiscally making right decisions for the American public, because after all, the money's coming from the American taxpayer.
Thanks, Roger. Now for some closing questions from our side. Uh, I have a question from my end. What are the 3, 4 things that you would recommend to an 18-year-old studying at the university today?
Well, I was going to try to say something funny about don't major in history, but I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say, be practical, understand that you have a real opportunity while you're in school to learn and to grow as not only learn a subject matter, but also grow as a person, take advantage of that. But be pragmatic and understand that those 4 years, they go by awful fast, and you have to you have to, support yourself and your family, and you have to be marketable when you get out. If I had to do it all over again, I would not have majored in history, but I would have taken as many history courses as I could as electives, and I would have spent a lot of time following around history professors, asking them questions. Um, Universities, I know in the U.S., I don't know what it's like anywhere else, but there's a lot of degrees that universities offer that you really got to scratch your head when. Well, I mean, it's interesting knowledge and it's good to have, but how are you going to utilize that when you graduate? And I guess it's the same way I look at knowledge management. Like I mentioned earlier, there's a ton of information out there. I can't catalog all that information. I have to be able to define what my long-term goals are. My long-term goals at NASA were to educate the national technical workforce. So that makes it a whole lot easier than siphoning through and filtering through all that vast knowledge to come up with, or all that vast information to come up with critical knowledge. And I guess I would take the same outlook if I was in a university. There's a lot of interesting stuff out there, but you got to determine what your long-term goals are for yourself and for your family, and how that information and what those courses and what that experience at the university, how's that's going to help you in the long term.
Roger, what are some of the books that have really inspired you over the course of your life?
Oh, well, most of them are going to be history books. So the one book that I mentioned earlier, the Eugene Ferguson Engineering in the Mind's Eye, I found that just eye-opening because he basically gives a history of engineering. And I really, and he understands engineers. I think he did a great job. There's a whole different catalog of other books that I've always fascinated in, and have to do with Russian history and German history and English history and American history. Part of the American Civil War, I think that's a fascinating topic for me because, and if you look at Abraham Lincoln, talk about somebody trying to make decisions under duress and having, faulty data and no data, and having the whole weight of the entire nation on your shoulders, and just seeing how somebody like that, from a personal viewpoint and from a historical viewpoint, can endure and succeed.
Roger, having spent such a long career, when you look back today, what does the word successful mean to you?
Um, Being content with yourself. Um, Money's nice, but if you don't feel good about yourself and you don't understand yourself, what's money going to give you? And besides, I can remember one of my first engineering courses. It was an introduction to engineering. The professor said, "Well, you're all here because you love numbers, but I could tell you one thing: none of you are going to end up after you become a millionaire by being an engineer." I thought, "Oh, we're not here to be millionaires. We're here to build hardware and make things." And in a way, he was right. And, I I do love engineering. I do love building things. I love figuring out how things work. It's fascinating, and I think as far as looking at engineers' creativity and innovation, how they can take a physicist and a scientist, they understand at this high level, but it's the engineer that comes in there and takes that knowledge and transforms it into a TV set or a computer or a rocket ship or an airplane. And I always found that kind of aspect to be fascinating. So again, it's doing what's right for yourself, and making the decisions that are going to help yourself, help your family. And when you're an engineer, you can also help society, which is really a neat thing to be part of. You can be on the cutting edge of new technologies, or you can be there fixing old technologies, and I think that can bring a great deal of personal satisfaction. The idea of just learning something new.
Roger, if you could invite 3 or 4 guests for a dream dinner, who would they be and why?
Oh wow, uh, Werner von Braun would be one. I would find it fascinating to talk to him.
Absolutely.
If know his history, working with the Germans and even being part of the SS, and then being surrendering to the Americans so that you can continue your studies on rocketry, and then coming to the United States, and going from that to becoming designing and being part of leading the team that developed the Saturn V rocket. It would just be fascinating to talk to him and the different angles and the different things that he had to went through in his life. And there's so many different historical characters, Albert Einstein, or even like I mentioned earlier, Abraham Lincoln. Just to talk to them to see, with Einstein, I mean, he wasn't even an engineer, wasn't really a scientist. He was part of studying patents in Germany. And he had this unbelievable intellect to become, one of the greatest thinkers of our time. And I guess I also like to have Swami and Vignesh for dinner too sometime. How's that?
Roger, my final question too is: what's the one piece of best advice anyone has ever given you?
Probably my father. And everybody has a certain unique relationship with their father, and the idea of he never gave up. He was the hardest working guy I ever met in my life. He worked in a foundry, and for the Ford Motor Company. He would come home smelling like a foundry because he was just immersed in the foundry dust and the suit and stuff like that. And I just wonder what made this guy tick. What made him get up every day to do that? And he had a hard job, and it was just his nature. And he would always tell me to never give up. Decide what your dreams are, and go out and tackle them. And when your father talks to you like that, it gives you that kind of inner feeling of the possible. Yes, I can do this. If my dad believes in me, I can do that.
Roger, my final question to you is, who would be a guest whom you would like to see in a future episode of ContraMinds?
I'd have to think about that for a bit. I think, and actually, part of my job when I was a chief knowledge officer was I read a lot, and that's how I came up with Eugene Ferguson and some of the other people. So I investigate them, and then I'll tell you who might be interesting. Susan Cain. She wrote a book called Quiet, and it has to do with introverts. And she gave an absolutely incredible TED talk. And she's an introvert, and she always felt like she was different from everybody else, and was always being in a meeting and you'd just be overwhelmed by an extrovert talking, and you never got a chance to talk or express yourself. I read this book, and I'm an introvert, and most of everybody that I engineering has some degree of introversion. So I watched this TED talk. I thought this was really fascinating, and I read her book. Then I contacted her, and we developed a course for NASA engineers, and it was really about, and it ties into technical authority and dissenting opinion, making sure people understand that people want to hear what you have to say, even if if you're sitting back thinking, oh, maybe I'll sound stupid if I bring this up. You won't sound stupid. You sound stupid if you don't bring it up. You just have to make yourself known, and make your ideas known, and participate. And I think Susan Cain, in her book Quiet, kind of expands on that. And certainly the course we developed with her help was a great. Again, it was really popular. We had a lot of folks attended, and a lot of interest in it. I think she's. If you watch her TED talk, I think you'll realize why I think she'd be a great guest on podcast.
Thanks, Roger.
Sure thing.
Thanks, Roger. It was an extremely, I would say, uh, the conversation was absolutely brilliant. It was very, very honest. It touched.
It was insightful, it was heartwarming, it was deep. I mean, I loved it.
I totally loved it, and thanks a lot for your time. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with us.
Oh, absolutely. This was fun. Hopefully, some of your listeners will find some of the things I said interesting or important. Who knows? But that's all part of knowledge sharing.
Absolutely. I think, as you rightly said, it's a part of how you, how you put it into content, how you convert information into knowledge. And I'm sure people are going to find this very useful. And this, I believe, is going to be one of the amongst the best episodes that ContraMinds has done till date. So we believe it's one of the best, 1.5 hours that we had, and we have learned a lot, and it has been a knowledge, learning session for both of us.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed myself.
Yeah, and Roger, we will also add links to your book, Lean Knowledge Management, How NASA Implemented a Practical KM Program, in our show notes and our links. And we'll also ask our listeners to go and get a copy if they really love this conversation. I'm sure they will.
Oh, that's great. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode. For selected links and detailed show notes, visit www.contraminds.com/blog. Follow ContraMinds on social media and let us know who you would like to see next on the podcast. If you're listening to ContraMinds on Apple Podcasts, do share your comments and give us a rating. We are keen to know what you're thinking. ContraMinds is also on YouTube. If you're listening to the podcast on YouTube, hit the subscribe button and stay up to date on all our releases. Thanks for listening and stay safe.